Mr. Grant, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Well, you are entirely welcome out there. Nice to be here.
You recently...
But please, we're pals. You can call me Jim.
Oh, yeah, Jim. Hey, Jim, what's up, man? Yeah. How about that?
Go back to Mr. Grant.
Okay. That's a good start. So I'm trying to ask about your conference that you recently hosted. It's, you host it every couple of times a year, right? And it's been legendary.
We have had 2 a year from about 35 years ago. Yes.
Oh, nice.
And through some act of quite unintentional clairvoyance, we did not have one scheduled for the spring of this year.
Yeah, well,
and we did have one scheduled for the fall, and we went through that. And it was an historic event. We had it at the Javits Center. And if you've ever seen the Javits Center, it's bigger than the state of, it's bigger than 2 Delawares, the Javits Center. It is an immense, cavernous conference center in Manhattan. They host such things as the auto show and the boat show. So here is little tiny Grant's Interest Rate Observer with about 50 live people on the premises that can seat, 1,000. And we had many hundreds viewing by webcast, but we were the first live event at the Javits Center since February, which is why I said historic. And the people there almost could not find the words to thank us for getting out of bed and attempting to relive life as it meant to be lived rather than, Zooming, virtual. I've come to despise the word virtual. How about you, Asner?
Yeah, same thing. Yeah, it's an interesting time, but seems like you adapted quite well. One thing I actually wanted to also ask you. So, was it any new idea or fresh idea on the conference, or something very controversial that you heard? Because you have very wide variety of speakers from different industries.
We had. I suppose the most controversial and certainly the most arresting was Stephanie Kelton, who is the doyen of modern monetary theory. She's a very formidable woman who teaches at Stony Brook University, but more to the point, was the head of the economics advisory unit for the Senate Budget Committee. I think she was also Bernie Sanders' economic advisor, both in 2016, 2020. And she wrote a book called The Deficit Myth. And she spoke and then took questions for half an hour, very generous with the time. And, it's a very, to many people, it's more than interesting, it is compelling.
What's your take on the MMT?
Sophistry. There are some very useful points of analysis that the MMT people have a very clear view, I think, on the weakness of quantitative easing and on many of the doctrines of contemporary central banking. The clarity of their analysis, which I think is the clarity in service of a poor outcome, but their clarity forces one to rethink one's position on the debt and deficits. And again, in fairness to the MMT believers, basically they say there's no such thing as the public credit for a country that can issue its own currency. The public credit is a false doctrine. What you must do is test the boundaries of your capacity to borrow in your own currency, to do good, to raise employment, to bring prosperity to more people. That's the essential message of MMT, that once you can issue your own currency, you are in the clover. And you can suppress interest rates to suppress the cost of borrowing. You can do all these things. And the only constraint on you, say they, is a rate of inflation of the CPI that gets out of hand. So once inflation picks up steam, then you cut back, but not until. So you can borrow $1 trillion a month until inflation picks up. And the debt is really nothing more than one side of the balance sheet. The other side is the savings of the people who buy the debt, you see. So one government's debt is another person's asset. That's if I'm doing it justice, that is the elevator pitch for MMT. But the key thing is so-called monetary sovereignty, by which they mean the capacity of a government to issue its own currency at its own pace, on its own terms.
So I'm assuming that you not really agree with this idea, right? Like, what do you think?
No. Well, the ideal monetary system is the gold standard, which benefits no one country, is equitable to all countries, and the gold standard joins the financial stability of a country with its capacity to produce and its ability to attract capital, not by means of coercion, but by means of a set of policies that encourage productivity and wealth creation. So we have not had a gold standard for, call it 100 years. But that's my frame of reference. And so what one must know about modern monetary theory, it is based upon coercion. Now, it's a very genteel form of financial coercion, they call it, I think. The pretty phrase is repression. That is the polite phrase for this form of coercion. But one of the claims that Stephanie Kelton made, which I think is simply wrong, she said it's not a left-wing doctrine. Oh, she said it's not a doctrine or program, says she. It is a means of perceiving. It is a set of propositions through which, or with the adoption of which, you can have a much clearer view on our public finances, which is true, I think. But then she says it's not left-wing. It's inherently left-wing because it is based upon coercion. And I, as you know, am against coercion.
One last question on MMT. So when inflation does pick up, how can you stop it? Like, and to what extent is it going to pick up?
You raise taxes. Now, let us put ourselves in the place of the world as it is rather than the world that the MMT theorists propound. The world as it is features such disparate personalities as Chuck and Nancy and Mitch, right, in the Senate, and outside the Senate, such bystanders as Hillary, and all manner of other personalities that affect or infect our public conversation. So MMT would have us believe that come necessarily nuanced inflection point, rate of inflation, that we will come together as a polity and agree to raise taxes such that the rate of inflation will be trapped and reversed then and there. Now, I ask you, does that picture come into focus? No, it does not come into focus.
So it's kind of neat theory in a vacuum of anything else.
Yeah, I think that it's a heuristic theory. As Professor Kelton says, it's a way of seeing the world. It's a way of asking questions. She said, so why isn't the government's debt somebody else's asset? Well, of course it is. And that's a valid perception, too often muddied in ritualized denunciations of the debt. And I myself have emitted not a few ritual denunciations of the debt over my course of my career. So I'm reading her book. My mind was open, and I thought, yes, but, and I filled it through with jottings. That's what you want out of a book, right? You want to be challenged, and I was challenged, but I've concluded that it's all spinach.
Jim, it's fair to say that you are leaning towards Austrian School of Economics, right?
Correct.
How would you describe Austrian school versus the traditional or Keynesian? What's the main differences?
The Austrian school has as one of its preoccupations the unintended consequences of, for example, the manipulation of interest rates. And I'm going to speak generally and perhaps not quite fairly, because I am speaking generally. I'll say that a Keynesian might say, well, let us suppress the rate of interest at 2%. That way, everyone can borrow who qualifies to borrow, and companies can invest, and governments can finance unemployment insurance, and especially in a pandemic, they can spend what must be spent. All right, that's the Keynesian approach. Keynesians say, Lord Keynes himself did say that in a depression, just have people dig holes in the ground and pay them, have them build pyramids. Just the fact of their working is going to get the pump primed, and people will be paid, they will spend, and we will escape the depression. So what an Austrian would say was, these rates misdirect capital. They perpetuate the problems that a recession or depression was invented to solve. We have these slumps for a reason. The reason often being the misallocation of capital that occurs during a boom. So during a boom, people it's crazy, right? They invest in crazy things, and people are caught up in the spirit of the wonderful expansion of money making, and they build redundant plants, they build all these white elephants. And the point of a recession is to kind of clear the board of redundancies and errors. But we say in a stock market is correcting. Well, what errors does the stock market correct? It corrects the errors of misallocation during the boom, or the stock market correction in a bear market corrects the excess of pessimism that is forcing low prices. So those are some of the differences between the Austrian school and the Keynesian school.
So do you think the principle of Austrian school of economics also kind of might face the political reality that people are not willing to suffer a little bit? They rather...
Yes, correct. Right. So one of the things I've studied in my life is the Depression of 1920 and 1921. It might seem to some of our viewers a curious thing to spend a couple of years on, but I've done that. And the Depression of 1920 and 21, exactly 100 years ago, was very severe in some ways. At the start, it was more severe than the aftermath of the stock market crash of 1929. So in 1930, people thought, well, at least this isn't as bad as 1921, they would say. Irving Fisher, the great economist, did say that. But unlike the Depression of the 30s, the Depression of 1920 and 21 was a short-lived affair that was over and done with in 18 months. It was severe in that unemployment, which is not then measured, was certainly in the double digits. The stock market was down 40% or so. Commodity prices sawed in half. Industrial production collapsed. Much suffering. But wage rates were flexible to the downside. And when prices fell, those low prices attracted investment from abroad. Gold came into America. The money supply was thereby increased, augmented. Companies found that with lower wages and lower prices, they could begin to make a profit. Inventories had been liquidated, therefore they needed to be replenished. And lo and behold, through natural forces of supply and demand, the economy recovered, and at length the 20s roared. But this was in the context of very high real interest rates, real meaning adjusted for inflation, and very orthodox approach to the government's budget. They balanced the budget during the Depression. So this, to me, is a model depression. When, in the world of the angels and of heaven, we won't have them anymore. But on earth, we do have these interruptions in the business cycle. And this, to me, was a model. It's now 100 years in the rearview mirror. And I noticed that no one is proposing a celebration to mark the anniversary of this signal event in our business cycle history. There's no nostalgia for it, as far as I can tell. And I could tell because I wrote the damn book on it. But you asked about whether the people are much less inclined. Yeah, suffering is out. It is not part of our zeitgeist. And when the stock market's down 20%, the Fed has to intervene, right? Or it's down 10%, the Fed says, God, stock market's so weak. And, you can make the same point. We are against wars too, right? Can you imagine World War I in this social and political context? It hardly comes into focus. We may yet have one, but it isn't because the public will stand for the casualties on the scale they suffered in the Second Battle of the Somme, right? And I think critics of the approach to the Depression of 1920-21 would say that you are asking the world to go back to a time in which people were prepared to suffer these deprivations and the interest. Well, it turns out that the outcome in 1920 was much more humane than the outcome in the 30s. 30s with 10 years, really, it took till 1946, in my opinion. The Depression began in 1929 and lasted, I say, to 1946. The war doesn't count. But still, your point is well taken, that we are a world, a society that is much less tolerant of suffering and deprivation. That's a good thing, and to a degree, in the sense of business cycle, it's a bad thing.
Do you think there's going to be a point when there is just no way but follow this fundamental, let's just call it Austrian principles? Because, I mean, you can only drop your interest rate so far, right?
Right. The question is, so where does this end? So if you go back just 20 years, go back to the tech bubble and its aftermath in 2000, 2001, where the Fed heavily intervened, drove the federal funds rate, its policy interest rate down to 1%. And they bought some securities to help the economy. And they announced that I forgot whether they announced it, they certainly hoped that by driving interest rates down so far, they would stimulate mortgage activity in the housing market, which they did to a fare thee well, rather to excess, we can now see. So fast forward to 2007, 2008, 2009, the response then was still more aggressive. Famously, QE, which stands for quantitative easing, which means kind of money printing in layman's terms. And the funds rate was now 0 rather than 1%. And with every successive bump in the road, with every successive bump in the night, right, the response is more aggressive until this pandemic, and even before the pandemic, in September of 2019, there was a kind of a technical glitch in one rather obscure segment of the market in government securities, and the Fed met that with a massive response. Well, I should modulate my language. It was massive. That means something we did with a heavy response to the Fed in the fall of 2019, exactly close to a year ago. Then comes a pandemic, and all the stops are out now. I mean, it took this country, my country, America, it took it 180 or 190 years to amass its first trillion of public debt, first $1 trillion. And in February, they're like doing $3 trillion a month, or March doing $3 trillion or April. It's $3 trillion in 1 month. So you wonder, I wonder, so where does it end, right? How much money do they print? How much borrowing do we absorb? With all due respect to Stephanie Kelton, it's somebody's asset, yeah. But it's denominated in dollars, and is the world prepared to accept on faith the value of this currency, which after all is collateralized by nothing except the might and majesty of the United States of America? We can't convert it into anything. At least not. The government won't allow you to turn your dollars into gold as it wants to. So I see the arc of evolution of these interventions, and I wonder, where does it end? You know the answer, Adrian, right?
No.
Thought I'd ask you,
What do you think?
I think it ends with an intervention that's so shockingly large that it disturbs confidence in our currency and forces a reconsideration of the ideas, of the protocols, and the ideology by which we have managed our monetary and fiscal affairs. I think that's what happens.
Are there any country in the world today that actually doing good job with their monetary policy?
Any government that's doing?
Yes.
No, I mean everyone has bought into modern methods. Everyone has come to believe that I'm might be slightly hyperbolic, but most everyone has bought into the idea that you can just control the inflation rate through, measured or not so carefully measured infusions of new currency and manipulations of interest rates and the like. So it's very much a hands-on interventionist school of monetary policy the world has adopted. And the Keynesians would say that, well, so the Austrian school would say, well, consider the consequences that you have not banked upon, like the rampant misallocation of investment dollars and the like. And so where does it all end? It ends in I hope it ends in a reasoned reappraisal, but certainly it's going to end in a bang to start with, because there would be a mighty crash of financial markets, I think. If you'd ask when, don't, because I don't know.
No, I won't ask that.
Okay.
In regards to COVID, you have a podcast, Current Yield, right? So I was listening to one of the episodes from February, and you invited the guest, and you guys were discussing COVID, and it seemed to me that you were very concerned about what might happen, but your guest wasn't really. He kind of downplayed it. When did you realize that COVID is a big deal?
I'm not sure that you don't have it reversed. I was not quite lackadaisical, but I was very fatalistic about it. It started with my wife and I went to London, went to England to participate in a conference at the University of Cambridge, and that was like the late February, first week of March. So I really had no idea of the gravity of this. I knew it was a problem, and I knew what did I know? I'm not sure how much I knew. I also was on CNBC. I've forgotten when. It was early going. And this is early in the show they call Squawk Box, early in the morning. And the hosts said, what about this pandemic? Well, we can't keep on doing what we're doing. I said, well, we have to make choices. All life is I'm paraphrasing now. Maybe I'm flattering myself, but essentially what I said was, all life is a trade-off. We have to get out of bed in the morning. We have to go about our lives. We cannot lock down for weeks or months on end. There are collateral damages to this lockdown business. The things you don't see are the things that will materialize later. Undiagnosed and untreated diseases of all kinds, heart disease, cancer, and the like, deaths of despair, divorces, businesses ruined, lives shattered. These things must be weighed in the balance of, well, we can't. And what I later came to believe, that was, I will say, in fairness to myself, that was my considered opinion upon gathering the obvious gravity of the pandemic as a medical proposition. But what I thought then was what I think now, which is that you can't stay in bed in the morning. There's a risk to that too. We have one of our kids is the mother of four, and she and her husband are raising these four kids in a not overly large house in Alexandria, a lovely house, but not overly large. So the four of them in there, the kids are not going to school except intermittently. And the kids are not learning as they might have learned in in-person classroom situations. And these difficulties are, of course, endemic during this pandemic. And this is the way we live now. And one of President Trump's advisors, a fellow who has been hounded for his lack of credentials. I think he's a physician, scientist, a good saying, but he's not an epidemiologist. His name is Dr. Atlas. Dr. Atlas. And what he said was, and I fully endorse, we cannot sacrifice our youth on the altar of our fears. Bingo. That's what I think. I'm 74, and I mean to live as long as I can, and I hope it's for a long time. But people my age ought not to lock up the world. In fairness to my age, I'm not sure we are urging that. But the message is coming down from on high. We must, presidential aspirant Biden, we have to lock down. No. We have to learn to live with this menace, with this annoying thing. Anyway, that's my speech. It's not more like a sermon, but that's where I stand.
So obviously you think that Fed probably overreacted to this? Or
yes, I do. And I think that the precedent of what the Fed did is going to haunt all of us in crises to come. Okay, say there's a recession. There is a recession. But say we get a vaccine, we get life returns to normal, then bingo, there's a recession. These things can happen. And say it appears to be a severe when the stock market is down, of course, as the commodity market's down, and employment's down. So what does the Fed do? How can it not do what it previously did? Right? It set this precedent, right? So all stops are out again. And I think this does terrific damage to the integrity of financial markets. You know, these prices, the interest rates are prices. And the technical lingo is the prices are either discovered in the marketplace through supply and demand, for people shouting in the floor of a commodity chain. They don't shout anymore, but they negotiate quickly, digitally. So prices are discovered between those who buy and those who would sell. That's called price discovery. So we have reverted, rather than to price discovery, to price administration. The Fed administers interest rates increasingly. And former chairman Ben Bernanke in 2010, I think it was, says, we're going to implement a program by which the stock market goes up and people feel richer and they spend more. And that he didn't say trickle down. That was a politically loaded term from yesteryear. That was a term Republicans inadvisedly used, and Democrats harassed them with it. But that was essentially the program. We'll trickle down into others' spending habits, and we'll all be better off. So the stock market has been levitating, but it becomes stupid. Right? It's a flyaway stock market. It's very richly valued. It's exhibiting classical signs of speculative excess, and therefore it is vulnerable to stepping in front of the proverbial bus. Right? Bingo. Prices are down. It was a bubble. It was a bubble. We all recognize it, and it goes a lot. So what does the Fed do then? Well, it intervenes again, right? And it blows it up again. So when do we get true prices? When do we get honest price discovery? When do we sort out the white elephants from the productive investments? That's the question.
There is no answer. Jim, I want to next actually learn a little bit more about you as a person. How about that?
May I take a sip of my beverage here without?
Sure, please. Diet Coke.
It's mother's milk. Very health-giving.
Yeah, Jim, where were you born and grew up?
I was born in Manhattan, and I grew up on Long Island, or as we say on Long Island, Long Island is what you say. I grew up in the middle of Nassau County, which is a middling commuting town right in the middle of Nassau County, and I lived there until I was to college.
What was the place like during your childhood?
Oh, it was a place of single-family houses for middle-income people, undifferentiated in topography, totally flat. And I couldn't stand it as a place. I love my family, and I still like them. But I yearned to get out. I wanted to grow up on a dairy farm. And people tell me now I have some experience with that because we have a place in upstate New York. In fact, I am speaking from that place in upstate New York. And it has some cropland, and it has some pasture. And I have seen cows up close. And I realize now that actually I did not want to grow up. But I wanted to be either a dairy farmer or play first base for the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Oh, that's a wide range of...
Yes. And actually, I was as misqualified to play first base in the Brooklyn Dodgers as I was to become a dairy farmer. You know what eye-hand coordination is? Of course, right? Yeah. I didn't know. What I should have known is I didn't have it. And here's a little childhood story that gets us to the present day. I grew up. I also wanted to be a naval officer, and I grew up not quite half blind, but the point survives exaggeration. My right eye was very, very nearsighted. My left eye was very astigmatic, and which I think accounts for some of my lack of eye-hand coordination. But I realized as soon as I was able to understand the qualifications for admission to the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, I realized I was not going to be admitted. It was a devastating realization. I must have been 12 or 13. And I said, oh, God. I said, so that was then. But as we live in an age of miracles, so about 2 years ago, I had cataracts. And I went in to see the surgeon to discuss how to deal with this. And he said, well, we'll pluck out the cataracts. Now, the question is, what do you want to be after we take that? I'll put in the lens. Do you want to have 20/20 distance vision, or do you want to have 20/20 vision up close? And we'll get through some small correction for distance. You can do that? Yeah. So I thought to myself, wait a second. If I have 20/20 distance, I can apply for readmission to the Naval Academy. To be sure, I would have been a rather senior midshipman at the age of 72 then, but I thought, well, I can certainly pass the physical exam. But I decided against it just because, my readers would be disappointed and it looked funny.
But you still end up you joined the Navy later on, right?
I did. I joined the Navy the first business day after I was 17. Well, I was an enlisted man. I was not subject to the same requirements. But
okay.
When I was taking the eye exam, I stood behind, there was a line of us, and of course I was wearing my glasses, so I memorized the eye chart.
So you gamed the system.
Yeah, so some days I was glad I did that when I was in the Navy. Other days I regretted my deceit. But I was a gunner's mate in the Navy, and I was on active duty for 2 years aboard the USS Hornet, which is an aircraft carrier, an obsolete aircraft carrier. And then I started college. I left one semester in college. Then I was a musician. I was a very good French horn player. And I lasted one semester in college where I said, I'm going to, this is very complicated. I enlisted when I was 17 with a commitment to 2 years active duty and 4 years in the Naval Reserve. This is when I was between my junior and senior years of high school, if you can fancy that. So so I started college, and I realized I didn't like college. I didn't like the love life in college, which there was none. And I thought, well, I am going to quit and go for my 2 years of active duty. So I told my parents that I am dropping out of college and joining the Navy. And they said, oh. They said, oh, isn't that interesting? And then I came back to school after my naval career, such as it was, ended. And I went to Indiana University with the hope of becoming a French horn player. I said I would take that up again, but you can't pick it up after what was that 2.5 years. I realized that, and I studied economics instead.
It's interesting to me, like, how did you switch from music to Navy to economics? When I got out of the Navy, I had 6 months before college started. I got out in February, and college started in September. Mm-hmm. So what I did was I got a job as a clerk in Wall Street on a bond desk. So I earned, in the Navy, I earned like $75 a month. In civilian life, I earned $75 a week. Big raise. That's pretty good. But I was around people who were making $100,000 a year, which in 1967 was a ton of money. And I thought, wow, how do you do that? And so when I went to college, I was interested in economics, and my very superficial financial experience as a clerk on a bond desk
maybe more interested in that. I studied economics, and then so that was that.
And then you went to Columbia for international relations, right?
Yes, right. Whatever that was. I never determined what international affairs actually was, but it gave me the opportunity to spend hours in the library. And I so loved it. I can still remember the smell of the stacks in Butler Library. You go there and you sit down, and I'm not sure about you, but when I love used books, and when I get one in the mail, now they're dirt cheap because these libraries are deaccessioning books, right? So you go on ABE Books, ABE Books. This is a commercial plug. And you find a book that's like, rather than going to the library, and up here where I am, the library facilities are limited, you buy a book for $3 or $4 and you get it in the mail, like this one. This is a book about 18th century English history. What you do, you get it in the mail, you open it, you go,
yeah.
And that's my recollection. I'm not sure I learned about international relations, but I did become quite a bookworm. I always have been a bookworm. And I spent happy hours in the stacks of Butler Library reading and inhaling.
You sound like a fun guy to be around back at the time, huh?
I was a riot.
It's funny. I used to live across the street from the public library, and one thing I liked about it, one of many things, like same thing, I like that smell, but they also had the grants interest rate observer for free, which was cool, like for the student it was great. So you studied international relations, and what was your first job after the university?
I was a reporter at the Baltimore Sun. And this was an exciting thing to do and a very lucky thing to do. A very nice man named William Schmick, who was the city editor of the Baltimore Sun, hired me, although I really had no substantive experience in journalism. And I went to Baltimore and learned all about it, making all the rookie mistakes that the Sun forgave me for. How many different ways can you misspell, for example, Allen, name Allen? Well, I discovered them. You can do 2 L's and E. You can do 1 L and an A. You can do 2 L's and an A, like that. So the craft of journalism seems simple, but actually it's quite complex. And so I spent for the first year, I was an ordinary city reporter. I covered crime and wrote obituaries. And you ever see a show called The Wire? It's a series on...
I've heard about it, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, it's set in Baltimore. It's all about drug criminality. And I covered crime for the Sun. I was so embarrassed when I saw it. It was a fascinating, gripping series. I knew none of this was going on. I was an ingenue covering crime. So that was about a year. And then then there was a vacancy in the financial desk of the Sun. And you must understand, Asper, that the business and financial reporting is the lowest prestige job in a major daily paper. It was at the time. It was 1974, maybe 73, 74. So I was the expert at the Sun on finance because I had spent 6 months working in Wall Street. Rob, can you imagine that? I was like Bernard Baruch. So I rather liked it, and then after about a year or so doing that, I decided I was going to apply to Barron's Financial Weekly, a newspaper, right? And I applied to Barron's, and my wife and I went to New York. Tricia was also a reporter on the Sun. We picked up and went to New York. I took this job in Barron's, and that's when I really, I determined to specialize in that, in finance, and I did. And I was there for 8 years.
Well, Barron's is a major publication. So what led you to leave this safe job and start Grant's Interest Rate Observer?
Well, I confess to you, there was nothing so high-minded as wanting to start the most informative and cutting-edge and funny and literate financial publication on the face of the earth. it was all about, although it certainly has become that, Asmir, if I do say so. But what led me to leave was an unseemly political quarrel between, intramural quarrel between the editor and the managing editor of Barron's. And I kind of picked the wrong side of that political argument. It's like a college English department in which the lower the financial stakes, the more charged the politics of the organization, right? So the financial stakes were not very high for us on the staff of Barron's, but the emotional commitment to one side or the other was very intense. And I sided with what turned out to be, for me, exactly the right side, because I felt I had to leave. All right, so I decided to leave. But what then? So I suppose I could have gone to work for Forbes or Fortune or the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. But I didn't want to be rewritten. I wanted to write my own voice, and Barron's was very good at allowing one's own voice. So I thought, well, I'm going to start Grant's Interest Rate Observer. So I took my $75,000 in Dow Jones profit sharing money and flushed it away in about 6 months, as one does starting a business, right? So I started this thing in 1983, quit around the springtime of 1983. And I had just completed the manuscript of my first book. It was Bernard M. Baruch, The Legend of a Story of Wall Street Legend. And Baruch was a famous speculator in his day, a political figure in the mid-20th century. So Grant's Interest Rate Observer would publish its first number in November of 1983 when my first book appeared. And I figured that when those two things happened together, I would be richer than Croesus. I would be overcome with new subscribers because they would read about this best-selling book and they would feel they'd have to subscribe to the genius who wrote it, right? Of course. So the book was published. Well, I gather it was published. There was no evidence of that in the P&L. It was reviewed in the New York Times. And the New York Times had assigned it to a bank PR person, bank public relations person. The bank but really didn't get it. And she wondered what this book was about. This book, the review was about 6 inches or 5 inches of copy in the Sunday Times book review. And let us say, it wasn't a rave. And then the first issue of Grants comes out. I had like 12 subscribers. But I take the envelopes in which the first issue of Grants is sealed and addressed to this somewhat exclusive cohort of first subscribers. And I have it in the taxi cab going up to the main post office on 34th Street and 8th Avenue, this wonderful, ancient old building. And, it's a moment of pride for the entrepreneur, right? You have the product in your hand. So I pay the driver, cab driver, get out of the cab drives away. I walk up to the building. I realize I left these envelopes in the back seat of the cab. Yeah, so that was the November 1983. That was my moment that was rather anticlimactic looking back on it.
Who was those 2 subscribers you had?
David Gale was one of them. He was a guy who was a pal of mine from Morgan Stanley. And Patricia Kavanaugh was one. Fine, she was my wife. And I think Louis Lehrman was one, his dear friend. And Alan Drescher was one. And John Holman was one. John Holman will figure in the story presently because my $75,000 of profit sharing went to Dow Jones. That did not last long. And before, I guess the spring of 1984, I was just about out of money, certainly out of optimism. And my wife, then an investment banker at Lehman Brothers, which then was solvent, organizes a kind of an IPO. And we were going to not go public, we were going to raise some money for our friends and fools and family. And oddly enough, not many people were interested in an unprofitable, obscure financial publication called Grant's Interest Rate Observer. But John Holman was. And he invested $35,000, and that got us over the hump. And it took about 3 or 4 years for it to become profitable enough so they could take a salary. But he was been a subscriber, an investor from that day to this, and it's rather worked out. But my goodness, it was slow starting. So discouraging at so many moments. But one persists.
How many times you wanted to quit, honestly?
Oh, all the time. To start with, it was just horrible. One day I remember the printer printed upside down.
Oh God!
And I remember I had just I'd poached a couple of eggs, and I pulled these eggs out of the saucepan, and I flung one into the sink, and the yolk splattered. This is upon realizing the print upside down. But there were moments of very deep discouragement. And my wife was a banker at Lehman, and she was making a good salary. But we were having kids. We wound up with 4 of them in a not over large apartment. And I felt as if I had actually made the wrong decision from time to time. But people would say, without intending to be condescending, they'd say, well, whether this works or not, I look forward to seeing you. And if it doesn't work, please come and see me get a job. No. You don't want to do that. You really do not want to do that. And, Patricia sustained me. Her optimism plugged the deficit of my I by no means always discouraged, but I actually always want to quit. I actually always wanted to punch somebody in the face. I didn't want to quit. That someone was the subscribers who weren't subscribing. It was nothing personal, just an abstract figure. But as I say, at length, it seemed to be working. It never. I don't leave the impression. I say it has worked. It's been a very good family business. It has never rivaled, as I say now, the mainstream media. There's always been a niche-y thing, and I suppose it is. It must be. It's kind of an eccentric thing. I mean, it runs 7,000 words. That's 30 double-spaced pages, or more or less, every 2 weeks, and it features still long-form journalism. I wrote this current issue, I wrote 3,000 words on modern monetary theory. The headline was Modern Monetary Mischief. And I not only wrote about Stephanie Kelton's presentation at the Grants Conference, a better book, but I also traced the idea of that preceded the formal modern monetary theory. I traced those ideas, gave a history of them, talked about the institution of the legal tender laws. In that history, I quoted Edmund Burke, I quoted James Madison, I quoted many other figures in economics, and so it's not. You wouldn't read this many places, and maybe it was self-indulgent in me. That's why we don't have a ton of subscribers. We have kind of like a 250,000 subscribers. But I think it is useful. I think that it helps for people to understand where these ideas came from, and understand that financial history didn't begin at the start of the last boom. And that's the purpose of the books I write too. It's to bring some substance, some historical depth to these analyses. Otherwise, can be much too present focused.
Yeah, and format is very unique. It's looks like 19th century paper. It's funny. There is the witty style.
It is proudly retro. I mean, I want it to look as good as its editor, or better.
Definitely hits you.
I want it to look. I want it to look like a good suit. I don't at Grass, we still wear neckties out of respect for the viewers, for the readers, for the money, out of respect for the work and for the language. I mean, I think that this whole dressed down idea is part and parcel of a certain slobbishness that I don't approve of. I mean, where it's not a stiff-necked office, I hope. At least I don't think so. But it's we work in the Woolworth building, which is where we have our office in Lower Manhattan. It's the famous skyscrapers of yesteryear. And we're next door to I gather, a very successful architectural firm that's full of young people, and they come looking as if they had just finished playing basketball. That's one way to live. I don't begrudge in that. I think, as I say, it's a very successful thing. I dare say it's more successful than ours. But I don't know. I like a more formal presentation, both in the way we look and in the way we appear to our readers.
And to be fair, this publication made you have the cult following. Like, I'm not trying to, how do you say polite, lick your boots? But like you have
Flatter?
this flatter. Here we go. But like you have this cult following that very few people in the industry have.
Well, it's a yes. I thank you. It is a dedicated bunch of nonconformists. Not every nonconforming idea is successful, and sometimes if you're being contrary, say on Wall Street, if you're being contrary for the sake of being contrary, you are really asking for trouble. And I had to learn that to my cost, and I dare say to the cost of some of my readers over the years. We try not to be ritualized in our views. We don't just say because so many people think it's so, it's not so. But that's a place to start, though, right? For example, ESG investing, right? That is now a cultish following, although on a massive scale, trillions of dollars are committed to the idea of decarbonizing the planet. But bear in mind that most of the exchange-traded funds that are labeled ESG are investing in the same 5 or 6 or 7 big tech stocks that other non-ESG funds are investing in. So you have to know where people are affirming a false doctrine, and you can, if there are enough that are affirming that, you know things are mispriced. It's like when you were growing up, right? You hear things and you nod. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Right. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day. I mean, is it? I don't know. It doesn't taste the best. Or if you wear sneakers, it'll ruin your feet. Right. Well, really? No. But as an adult, you hear things too. You hear that you must be indexed. Well, that has been a very profitable thing to do. And so many smart people have discovered reasons for implementing that idea. Vanguard, the late, great Jack Bogle founded for us today with this immensity of a thing called Vanguard Investments, on the premise that cost is really all that matters if you own the whole stock market. But we at Grants live and die by the doctrine that every good idea is pounded into the ground like a tomato steak. Every good idea becomes a bad idea through over-application, through massive convergence on that theme. And presently, the massed convergence results in overpricing of the favored idea and the underpricing of competitive ideas. So, we also believe that that the future is a closed book, but you can at least get a read on the future by observing how the present is handicapped, right? How people are laying out the odds on the future. Are they buying too much of something, thereby indicating they have a much too certain view of a future outcome? Right? So the world over, like 15 trillion or so of bonds are priced to yield less than nothing in nominal terms, meaning that if you held these bonds to maturity, you would get back less than your principal. So high is the price. Right? This is the thing. So it's the first time in 4,000 or 5,000 years of recorded history of interest rates it's been a thing, but it is a thing today. So what does that tell you? It tells me that people are of a decided and hard consensus that the value of money will increase despite the central bank's best intentions, that these bonds will be okay because others will buy them at an even higher price. They might be right, but we see this as an excess and as a sign of a kind of a bubble. And we look to the opposite point of view as a place to look for ideas. So again, you said the word cult, and yes, to be sure, there is that element here. I try to keep it as far away from Jonestown as possible. So we are not contrary for the sake of being contrary, nor are we determinedly cultish. If we happen to collect a cultish group in their dedication and their propensity to renew their subscription, that's fine. But we don't set out to start a cult.
I want to have one follow-up on this question. So, you know how Buffett famously suggests to people to invest in indexes. What is the guarantee, if there is any, that investing in the market as a whole is not gonna end up like Japan, right? Japan, I believe from 80 to 2000, the return on the overall market was almost negative, right? Something like that. Like, what's your take on that?
Yeah. Well, we live in a blessed age of finance. We mortals today. Think of it. Interest rates have been falling since 1981. Next year marks the 40th anniversary of this great bull market in bonds, meaning a great bear market in interest rates. Bear market meaning interest rates have fallen. Not steadily, but, well, yeah, steadily, if irregularly. But 40 years? You get used to it, right? Stock prices have been going up mostly for that time, to be sure, with some bumps in the road on the back of these. So this has been a two-generation bull market in financial assets. Extraordinary. Now, look at other intervals in our financial history. There was if you had written, say, in the year 1937 about the nature of common stocks, you would have written that between 1900 and the present day, that the market had availed you almost nothing based upon the indices then in use. You could have picked out railroad issues, which there were, and some industrial issues, and you had pointed to the Depression of 1921, you had pointed to the Depression in 1929, and a lot of creative destruction along the way, a lot of stocks that, now we're talking about indices, now we're talking about individual stocks, they just went away. And you would conclude that common stocks are full of risk. And the word security itself is a misnomer, right? There's no security that's where it comes from. It comes from secure. And that essay was, in fact, written in the Saturday Evening Post, then the best-selling American mass circulation magazine. It was written by a partner of Brown Brothers, economist, a firm still extant. So your view on the inevitability of a favorable outcome in finance depends upon the world in which you live, right? And this is a world of miracles. You can go and get your eyes fixed, right? Take your cataracts out and get 20/20 vision. Reapply the needle. That's one example of how, right? The world is a wondrous place full of technology, but also it's a world full of human beings, right? It's a world full of crazy ideas. It's a world of ever-present totalitarian temptation. So there's nothing that says, to answer your question, nothing that says that it's inevitably true that by investing in the whole market, you will do well. That has been the experience, has been. It is true, and I hope it will be ever true, that America is a great country. Will it always reward patient holders of equities? No. Well, at least it has not in the past. It has not always in the past. So Warren Buffett is speaking his book, The Life of Someone who, and he acknowledged himself, who came into the best country, if I say that, the best continent, North America. I'll give this to Canadians and Mexicans. But somebody came into one of the world's great countries of all time at the very moment when American greatness was becoming manifest into the doctrine of American exceptionalism, right? And so he has lived in the greatest of times, speaking the greatest, most ubiquitous of languages, right? So we are living in a free world, speaking English, the world's language. Markets are up. But is that that's tomorrow's program? We don't know. We really don't know.
Jim, you wrote, I believe, at least 9 books that I've seen. I think your latest one was Walter Bagehot, right?
Yes.
Why did you choose this subject? Why did you choose him? What's so interesting about him?
Well, Walter Bagehot was a financial journalist. And once I gave a talk at an awards ceremony. I was there for an award. And this is an award ceremony given to financial journalists, right? So I went there. And I said, thank you for this. I'm grateful for this. But you know what? We should never forget that when you stand at the pinnacle of financial journalism, if you stand at the pinnacle of financial, you are nonetheless standing at sea level. And this was met with a certain silence in the audience. I thought it was very funny because we met with a stony silence, but it's true. The financial journalism is a slightly humdrum craft, is mostly practice. But Walter Bagehot, who lived in the 19th century, was one of the few people who could actually possibly qualify as a genius, one of the few practitioners of this craft. Walter Bagehot was the author of the English Constitution. Famously, he was the editor of the Economist in the 1850s, 1860s. Economist being, of course, the ubiquitous London-based weekly journal. And Bagehot was the most extraordinary journalist. So he was when I came to New York to work for Barron's, I would go to the public library and sit down and get the bound volumes of the Economist from the 1860s. And I could pick out Bagehot stuff by the sheer elegance of his style. And I wanted to be that guy. I wanted to be as good a craftsman. Whether or not I'm not sure he was a genius, but he was a craftsman, a supreme craftsman. I want to be a supreme craftsman. I'm not a genius. So anyway, I said, I'm going to write his life one day. And I did. His life. And I discovered that he was a banker's son and that his bank, get this, his bank was earning 40 and 50% per year on the partner's capital while he was a part of it. So he wrote about banking, the son of this of a regional mid-size English bank. But he lived this charmed life in literature and in journalism. He died young, which is not so charmed. Anyway, I enjoyed the experience of writing it. I enjoyed living in that world. But they say that the past is a foreign country, and you get to leave your own kind of your space and time and be with somebody else.
I'm wondering, those 40 to 50%, is it levered? What was the leverage there? 50 times?
Leverage was 20 to 1, but the partner's capital, visible capital, was supplanted, was augmented by the legal liability of the partners for the debts of that bank.
Oh, got it. Interesting.
So in the event of impairment or failure, guess who got a capital call? The owners.
That's so... banks would collect.
I love that. That was a law of land in America until the Banking Act 1935. Their liability was limited in most cases, but Brown Brothers Harriman today, the niche bank in New York, it's a partnership, only general partnership among substantial financial firms, I think, in America. So those partners too live in sort of Damocles, and they take very little balance sheet risk. But they themselves, the Brown Brothers, are on the hook for their houses, their Picassos, and their golden retrievers in case something goes wrong.
I didn't realize that. Huh? Yeah. Interesting. So
isn't that the moral way to run a leveraged financial institution? And the owners bear the onus of failure rather than the taxpayers?
It is, but I don't see. I thought the Goldman Sachs was the last one that abandoned that more.
Well, I think it abandoned in 1997. I'm
Yeah,
not saying that it exists today, except for I'm saying I'm conceding
yeah.
that it's an obsolete doctrine, but I'm saying that it's a moral proposition to me.
I certainly
It has
agree.
everything to say for it.
Yeah. One thing about budget, wasn't he the person who, wasn't it his idea to of somewhat quantitative easing, not quantitative easing per se,
Well,
but
he is the muse,
Mhm.
MUSE, the muse, the kind of the god of inspiration of central bankers, because he said, in the panic, a central banker ought to lend freely against sound banking collateral and at a high rate of interest. And the reason for a high rate of interest is to ration dollars, which then could not be materialized on a computer screen. But so that was the Bagehot doctrine. And Ben Bernanke, in his memoir, The 2008 Crisis, quotes Bagehot over and over again, saying we should do this. But of course, this has now devolved into lending against anything at all, against a very low rate of interest. So it's been kind of dumbed down. But yeah, Bagehot was the he didn't invent this doctrine, but he popularized it. I say he was the muse of today's central bankers. They invoke him as a public intellectual of great stature in the history of thought. They invoke him as to rationalize what they're doing. He was as I say, an interesting character, an imperfect one. He was a rankest of misogynists, and I tell this to people, and I immediately lose half the potential book buyers in the room.
One last question. So, what life advice would Jim Grant give to younger self?
Not only can't you hit the curveball, you can't hit the fastball. Exactly, I would tell this young person. So, let me try this. You want a serious answer to this? I'm going to give you a serious answer. Let me try again. You can do it.
That's simple. Jim, thank you very much for being on the podcast. I appreciate your time.
Oh, you are welcome. What a pleasure. And what a great bedside manner you have out there. Thank you for asking me on.